Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll show you how to use Fluxor, a Redux library for Blazor to manage application state. In episode 15, I showed you how to manage application state using a custom cascading app state value and also a service that you can inject. Fluxor and Redux use the Flux pattern to maintain an immutable state. That's right, you don't just update the state, you replace it. Okay, it's not that simple, but there's a bit more ceremony involved here, but that's why you're watching Blazor Train, right?
Right.
I'll set you straight on how to use Fluxor in your Blazor apps. Coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train! All right, so let me first use the documentation of Fluxor to disambiguate between the terms Flux, Redux, and Fluxor. Fluxor is a wrapper around the Redux JavaScript library with a few nice things for Blazor built right in. So the pattern is as follows. You got a button. This is our click counter button. Yes, we're going to start with the counter, but we'll get around that. Just bear with me. That uses a dispatcher to call an action, and the action then, through the dispatcher, calls a reducer, which combines the state, the current state, and the action, which has information about how to modify the state or how to create a new state. And then it creates a new state and replaces the existing state. So it's really all about immutability. Whereas in this episode of Blazor Train, Application State, episode 15, I showed you how to manage application state just using standard stuff, right? But the problem is that you can just reach in anywhere and modify that state. And so this is a bit more bulletproof because nobody can just reach in and modify the state. The state is immutable. It's read-only. And so in order to set values on the state, you have to create a new state using either combinations of existing values and new values, or all new values, or whatever. But it's up to the reducer to do that job for you. So yes, there's a bit more involved than what I did in episode 15. But as you'll see in later episodes, and hopefully you'll get it in this episode, it's more flexible. And it's better for a situation where you have like a dashboard, like a single page application, and there's lots of components that all need to update the state. And Facebook is a perfect example of a spa where updating one thing in one little box is going to change things in other boxes that other users are watching and all of that. So I think you'll get the power of Redux and Fluxor in this episode. There's going to be much more to do. You can do that on your own time. But what I'm going to try to do here is give you a really good start. I had some questions that I got answers to right away. And so hopefully that will set you down the right path in using Fluxor. So we have here a hosted Blazor WebAssembly application called Fluxor Demo. And we're just going to be using the client project here. We're not going to be dealing with the server or the shared project at all, but I just wanted to get that out of the way. So let's add the Fluxor library to the client project. Now, I'm just going to paste in a package reference, but you could just go to the NuGet library for Fluxor Blazor Web, and you can either copy this right here, or you can just search for fluxor.blazor.web, and that's the package you want to install. Now I'm going to update my program CS in the client to support all the code that we're going to do. So I've got my global using for Fluxor. I've got a couple of namespaces that don't exist yet because we're going to add a store folder. And then this is the cool thing right here. Look at this. I'm getting the current assembly, which is type of program, this assembly. And I'm calling services add Fluxor with the option to scan the assemblies. So this is like a one-stop shop. So it's going to find all the states, all the actions, all the reducers with this one line of code. I love it. The next thing we're going to do is go to our app.razor file and do a little bit of ingeniousness, which is to add this across the top. Look at this, fluxor.blazor.web.store initializer. So the Redux library is a JavaScript library, right? And so you've seen me do this before, initialize calls to JavaScript in the onAfterRender virtual method, and then check to see if it's the first render, and then I know that JavaScript is already up and running. Well, if you have a component that is going to initialize JavaScript, you could just put it right here, because by the time this guy shows up, everything's ready to go. Pretty smart. All right, now let's add that store folder. So this one folder is going to contain classes for state. And yes, in episode 15, I had one master class called AppState. But the problem with stuffing everything into one class is now you have to instantiate all that data for every component, whether or not they use the different pieces of AppState that are in there. And so what Peter Morris did in Fluxor is he recommends that you separate out state by use cases, right? So the use case of updating the counter, or the use case of searching for a customer, or the use case of dealing with the toolbar data. For example, we're going to do that. That's how you would granularize your state. And so in all these different use cases, you're going to create a folder for each of them, and then the classes that are just for that use case get put under there. And so that means you can be more granular in how you instantiate state. It's pretty smart too. So yes, I told you we're going to use the counter demo. We're going to do that. So we're going to rename this folder counter use case. And to this folder, we're going to add a class called counter state. So it's very important that state classes, first of all, use this feature state attribute, and that also the values of this state are going to be read only. You see, there's only a getter, not a setter. And so it's whoever creates this counter state, which is going to be, yes, the reducer, that's where the values get passed in. So yes, we have a default constructor, which we need if we're going to create custom constructors. And there should really only be one custom constructor, and that is where you specify each value of the state for this use case. Now, there's only one value in this state that we need to read and set, click count. So that's why the custom constructor only accepts that one click count. All right, now let's take over the counter page. And this is the boilerplate code that comes with the Blazor template. So you can see I've removed the code because we're going to create a code behind class for this. But rather than using our click count variable, we're going to use the counter state value click count. So we have to inject counter state, and we also have to provide a new increment count. So let's create the code behind file. So here you go, got my partial class counter. I'm injecting the counter state as an I-state of counter state. And I'm also injecting a dispatcher. And this is a Fluxor iDispatcher. So we need all of these things. Now, we're going to create this increment counter action and call dispatcher dispatch with that action. So we need to create this class right here, increment counter action. Now I'm going to create this in the store folder itself, not in increment use case. And this is a recommendation from the Fluxor people. And I kind of get it. And that is that anybody, anywhere can call this action. This does not need to be tied to the state or the reducer in terms of, where it is in your folder structure. So I'm just going along with the documentation as to where to put these things. So now we don't actually have to have anything in here, but it does have to be a class. Now we're going to come back and customize this in a minute. So I'm going to just leave it as it is, and then we'll come back and actually add something to it. Now let's create a custom class for all of the reducer methods that we're going to use on the counter. That is going to go in the counter use case folder, and let's call it reducers. All right, so just so you can see, here's the folder structure and my reducers class. I have to put a reducer method on every method that we're going to use to reduce the state. And we're going to have a public static method. And the pattern for the naming is whatever the action is. In this case, it's increment counter action. And you notice there are two arguments, the state, counter state, and the action, increment counter action. So we're going to return a new counter state, setting the click count to state.clickCount plus 1. So that essentially increments the counter. Now don't worry, we'll come back to this. So now we're able to run it. Okay, now we can go to counter, click on the counter, it does increment, and of course, because the state is no longer inside the page, it exists outside the page, it doesn't get reinitialized every time. All right, great, cool. Now let's actually modify the action, because remember, this action has to do with what are we going to do to change the state, right? We're going to create a new state, and you could think of it as modifying the state. Okay, that's fine, but that's not actually what happens, right? We're going to create a new state. And this might be where you could change the increment value, okay? For example, change it to 2. So we do something like this. Public read-only int increment equals 2. Can't be changed. There it is. Now back in the reducer, instead of saying state click count plus 1, we'll say state click count plus action dot increment. See how we're using the state and the action together to create a new value? Because the state is what's existing, the action is what we want to do to change it. Now we're incrementing by 2. Click it again, 4, etc. Now because the state is outside the component, and we can inject it into other places. See, we inject iState of counter state. We can inject it into other components where we want to access the state. So let's do that with the nav menu. Check this out. So here I'm injecting my counter state, and then down here where we have the counter link, we can show the click count in parentheses. Now this is cool because the state doesn't exist within the counter page. So when we run this, you can see that the counter state has a value, and it's 0. And as we increment here, it also increments over here. There you go. And if you saw episode 15, this should be no surprise to you, but it's still a good thing to point out that all you have to do is inject the state, and then you can display the state. Well, that's almost all you have to do. Let's go back to counter. Did you notice this inherits statement? Why do we have to inherit a Fluxor component? Well, what that gives you is the ability to refresh whenever some other component updates the state. So in this case, it isn't going to matter because the counter page right now is the only thing that updates the state. So let's run the counter page without that base class inheritance thing. And everything still works, right? But what if we take that out of the nav menu? And yes, it's there in the nav menu. I did put it in there. Let's remove that line of code and try it again. Watch over here. Uh-oh, not refreshing. Now if I move off it and it reinitializes, yes, it's going to get the value from the state. This may or may not be a problem for you, but I have a solution. Let's say our counter page already inherits from something else. And there could be a million reasons why you're inheriting a base class. MVVM comes to mind, right? What happens if we try to have 2 inherits statements? Now this one is already obvious, but if we try to do 2, we get this error. The inherits directive may only occur once per document or per component. In other words, there is no such thing as multiple inheritance in .NET. There never has been. So what if we can't inherit from Flux component yet we need to know when the state changes? Well, here's a pattern for you. The iDisposable pattern. So we're going to implement iDisposable, and then in our code behind class, we've got these 3 things here. On after render, if it's the first render, we're going to wire up the counter state changed event. Yes, it has a state changed event to our state changed handler, which is just an event handler, and we're going to refresh the page. State has changed. And we need iDisposable because we don't want to leak memory. When this component is ending its life, we're going to unhook the event handler. Now, just to show you that it's going to run, there's no reason for it to run because it knows already when the state has changed because it changes the state. Okay, all good here, but let's implement it in the navbar. Okay, so up here, yes, we are injecting the counter state, but now we're implementing iDisposable and we are not inheriting from the Fluxor component. And here are those same three methods. On after render, that's when we hook state changed, and dispose, we unhook it. There you go. So I'm not saying you should use one or the other. What I'm saying is now you have options. If you don't already have a base class that you need to inherit from, great. Inherit from Fluxor component and you don't have to do any of this stuff. But if you already have a base class and you absolutely have to derive from that base class, then you can use the event subscription model. Up to you. Now in episode 15, we did this demo of the toolbar having state and being able to update that state, and also the index page being able to update the state and the toolbar reflecting it, right? And this is where stuff like Fluxor really shines. That when you have this sort of dashboard type of application with lots of components that all need to reflect the current state of something that one of them changed. So I'm going to add a folder to store called Toolbar Use Case. And we're going to add a toolbar state class in there. And this is where we're going back to that demo that I did in episode 15. So we've got our feature state, we've got two read-only properties, message and enabled. Message is a string, enabled is a Boolean. And now the custom constructor for toolbar state includes a message and enabled. So this is what our reducer will set when it's creating a new one. So while we're at it, we're going to add a global using over here in program, toolbar use case. And because we're not going to have a code behind for the toolbar, we'll need a couple of things in imports razor. Fluxor, the store namespace, and the store toolbar namespace. Now we'll create an action in the store folder called set message action. Now the set message action has a message property. Now this isn't the state, so I don't have to worry too much about this being immutable. But what I am going to do is allow the caller to set the message when we create the action. And then the reducer is going to use this message to change the state. Follow me? So the action has the things that we're going to change, and then the state is immutable. And then the reducer actually creates a new state based on the old state and the action. So this is good. Now let's add a reducer to toolbar use case. Call it reducers. Now this gets interesting. So we have our reducer method in a toolbar state, and this one is reduce set message action, passes in the state and the action. We're going to create a new toolbar state from the action message, which is new, and state enabled, which is not new. It's the current state. Now we haven't even done enabled yet. We'll do that after. But this is the current value in the current state. Now let's create the toolbar. So that's in the shared folder with all the other components. I'll create a razor component, call it toolbar, and here we go. Now we're not inheriting from any other base class, so it's fine to use the Fluxor component here. In fact, it makes it easier. If you can use it, use it. We're injecting iState of toolbar state, which is our toolbar state, and we have our iDispatcher. So all this is pretty much the same as it was in episode 15, except instead of appstate.message, now we have toolbarstate.value.message. And then when we update the state in the button, instead of saying appstate.message equals, what we're doing is creating an action with that message, right? In the constructor, we're passing the message, and then calling dispatcher.dispatch, passing that action. Now we have to see the toolbar, right? So let's go to our main layout, and we're going to change this across the top to toolbar. Now we can take over our index page. Okay, We're inheriting from Fluxor component, good. We're injecting our toolbar state, just like we did in the toolbar. We have our iDispatcher. We're showing the message here in H3, toolbar state.value.message. We're going to hold off on the enable code for a minute. And just like we did before in the toolbar, it's the exact same code. Message updated at. We could do something like index updated message at. And up here in the toolbar, we could say toolbar updated message at. And now let's run it. Update the message from the index. Index updated message at. Toolbar updated message at. Right? So there you go. Easy. All right, so now let's work on the enabled thing. What do we need? Well, we need a set enabled action. Right? So let's do that over here in the store folder. So here we have a value enabled, which we're going to pass in on the constructor just as before. Now we're going to go to our reducers in toolbar use case, and we'll add a new reducer. So this time we are taking the message from the state, the current state, and we're taking enabled from the action where it was opposite up here for the message. Because the only thing that we're going to change is enabled, and we get that from the action. Are you beginning to see how this works? It's pretty powerful. Now let's change index to update the enabled property. There you go. So we have our Boolean enabled is not the toolbar state value enabled. So if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. We're creating a new set enabled action with that value enabled, and we're calling dispatch with that action. Here's our message just as before. And now, boom, we can toggle enabled. And it's reflected in the toolbar. Oh, and by the way, counter still works, still reflected in the nav menu, and that doesn't change the other state bags that we have in our application. So granularity, immutability, all really good things. I love Fluxor, and by the way, you should take a look at the rest of the documentation. Under Blazor for Web, look up effects, middleware, and Redux dev tools. Once you get through my code, I would go through these things to really, really appreciate the power of Fluxor, because it's so much more than just what I showed you here. Hey, that's my demo today. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. Fluxor is very powerful. Don't be surprised if I don't cover the more advanced features in future episodes.
Don't be surprised if I don't watch.
Promise? Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blaze a train.